So welcome to our webinar. My name is Claire Wayner, and I am a senior associate here at RMI on our carbon-free electricity program. And I am excited to welcome you all to our webinar today on the importance of state regulators for cost-effective transmission build-out. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can during a live Q&A. Next slide, please. Our objectives for this next hour are to, 1, demystify transmission processes, including planning, cost recovery, and permitting. 2, explore the importance of state regulatory leadership for the grid. And 3, identify ways that state regulators can enhance transmission outcomes. Next slide. I am joined by my RMI co-author and colleague, Alyssa Perez, as well as guest speaker, Carrie Zalewski, who is the Vice President of Transmission and Electricity Markets at the American Clean Power Association and a former commissioner with the Illinois Commerce Commission. Next slide, please. All right. So our agenda for today is as follows. We'll start with opening remarks from Carrie, followed by a slide deck presentation giving an overview of RMI's new handbook, the state regulator's role in transmission. You can find a link to our website where you can download the handbook in the Zoom chat. And we will then close with an interactive discussion and Q&A featuring questions from our audience. With that, I will pass it to Carrie for her opening remarks.
Thanks, Claire. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here. As Claire mentioned, from 2019 to 2023, I served as the chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission. And like all regulators on paper, my mandate at the time was simple: keep the power reliable and affordable. But in practice, with things like rising demand and rising electricity costs and extreme weather and rapid shifts in generation, it was anything but simple. So today, with a little more perspective from my current role, I see transmission as the single most important and oftentimes most overlooked tool that we have to deliver on that mandate. To level set, DOE says that we need to double or even triple our transmission by 2050 just to keep up with the need. Yet we are building fewer lines than ever. This really is a recipe for higher bills and weaker reliability. And as you know, transmission isn't just lines, it's how we unlock cheaper power and share across regions during times of the highest stress, and also replace aging infrastructure before it fails. If you haven't had a chance to read the RMI handbook, I truly encourage you to do so. It's chocked with full of ideas and information and clear examples. The handbook itself makes it very clear that state regulators have a role to play in every phase of a transmission line's life cycle. For example, as it pertains to planning, regulators can ensure state policies and priorities are reflected in regional plans. This means pushing for right-sizing projects as they serve both local and regional needs, and requiring utilities to integrate transmission into their resource planning and not treating it as an afterthought. In Illinois, for example, we launched the Renewable Energy Access Plan to proactively identify development zones. This was a step that made planning more coordinated and cost-effective. This example is referenced in the RMI handbook. For cost allocation, under FERC's New Order 1920, regulators have a new opening to influence how costs are spread. This provides an opportunity to advocate for benefits-based methodologies so customers in each state pay in proportion to the value they receive. It's a fairness issue, but also a trust issue with the public. With regard to permitting, this is where regulators may have some of the greatest leverage. By using the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity proceedings to require community benefit plans and serious considerations of advanced technologies, commissions can turn what is often a contentious process into one that builds public trust and social license to operate. As for cost recovery, regulators can shape how transmission investment are reflected in retail rates. Tools like rate riders can speed recovery for projects that underwent robust regional review, and shared savings for gets, aligning utility incentives with public interest outcomes. Now, a word about the RMI handbook. This resource lands at the perfect moment. It really cuts through the jargon and shows plainly, here are the levers that regulators can pull. Planning, permitting, cost allocation, cost recovery, all in one resource. For commissions, it is a practical playbook. It's not just another report. And as I reflect upon my service in Illinois, proactive engagement really paid off, whether planning for zoning corridors for renewables or through my work through OMS and OPSI. I learned and now see that the earlier that regulators leaned in, the better the outcomes for affordability and reliability. So, my message to regulators is simple. Your role is not peripheral, it is central. Transmission decisions we make today will shape affordability and reliability for decades. Because at the end of the day, it isn't about towers and wires, it's about delivering reliable, affordable, and equitable service to the people we serve. Thanks again for having me, and I really am excited to continue on with the conversation.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thanks for those kind words about the handbook. Your framing, I think, makes clear why state regulators' attention and engagement on transmission issues is so critical, and so critical right now. I want to echo some of what you already laid out and stick with this big picture um, to dive into a bit why transmission matters and the benefits that it offers to states. Next slide, please. So, as Carrie mentioned, electricity demand is rising, and so are prices. We've all seen the headlines. High voltage transmission is essential to meet new demand while maintaining reliability and keeping power affordable. Study after study has confirmed this for us and told us that transmission isn't just necessary, but that high voltage transmission in particular delivers immense benefits. The chart in front of you is just one example. It draws from a recent RMI analysis of 7 regional and interregional projects. Using historical data, my colleagues quantified the benefits of these projects and found that every single project had a benefit to cost ratio above 1, even the lines that were only designed for reliability, meaning that their benefits outstripped their cost over their financial lifespan. Another way you can think about this is for every dollar that was invested, these projects saved ratepayers between $1.10 and $3.90. And one of the primary ways that they did that, they saved ratepayers money, was by relieving congestion, meaning they allowed greater use of cheaper and more efficient generators on the grid. Next slide, please. These kinds of benefits that transmission provides, again, particularly these high voltage projects, are deeply aligned with state regulator mandates and goals, as Carrie just mentioned, reliability, keeping the lights on, including during more frequent extreme weather events, affordability, ensuring individuals can pay their bills, and also that the prices allow businesses to be competitive. And third, advancing state policies, whether that's economic development, electrification, or clean energy integration. And this just skims the surface of some of the benefits that transmission offers. If you're interested in learning more or about your region specific needs, we're going to link our transmission resource library in the chat with some relevant materials that you can review on your time. Next slide, please. So now that we've just covered some of the big picture, Claire and I are going to walk you through the transmission life cycle and share some concrete ways that state regulators can shape outcomes at every phase, which Carrie had already started kind of detailing for us, and we're going to dive into those. Next slide, please. At a high level, the development of a transmission project can be broken down into 4 key phases: planning, cost allocation, permitting, and cost recovery. Like any model, this one isn't going to capture every situation perfectly, but it can provide a useful framework for identifying state regulators' points of intervention in transmission development. Next slide. So zooming in into each of these phases, starting with planning, this is where grid planners figure out what transmission is needed and which projects can meet those needs. There's 3 levels. Local planning happens within a single utility's footprint. It's led by the incumbent utility. Local transmission projects that result from this planning process are usually smaller and they're lower voltage. They also usually do, or They do not face competition and are rarely subject to regional review. We also then have regional planning. This is led by entities established through FERC Order 1000, namely RTOs and ISOs. Here, planners will look at needs across multiple utility footprints, then ask developers for project proposals, and then choose solutions based on a set of criteria, technical, economic, and constructability related. And most regional projects will go through some competitive planning process, but there are some exceptions, like in states with right of first refusal laws, or in cases where there is an urgent, immediate need project. The procedures that govern those competitive planning processes are regulated by FERC, but states still play an important role, specifically through the stakeholder processes. Regulators can influence planning assumptions, can um, inform modeling scenarios and selection criteria that ultimately shape the needs and projects that regional planners will move forward with. And then not pictured here, but the third level of planning I wanted to cover, and that's important to note, is interregional planning. This is where multiple regions plan projects together across their regional footprints. It's unfortunately rare in the US today, despite its benefits, but we believe that state regulator engagement can help to shift that. Next slide. Beyond FERC regulated planning, there are a few state level processes that also touch transmission, or at least could in theory. So first, integrated resource plans. Utilities across much of the country prepare IRPs to outline their future investments. But as this map on the right shows, not all states have IRPs, and those that do vary a lot in what they require. So what has to be included, whether plans need to be filed, and whether they need PUC approval to move forward. Most important to note here is that most IRPs do not include transmission as a constraint or an alternative to generation. Um, and then second, moving to state level transmission planning, here states look specifically at transmission needs within their borders. This is still pretty rare, but some prominent examples are Colorado and New Mexico, which set up separate transmission authorities, and Minnesota, which has a legislatively mandated biannual transmission report. And finally, wildfire mitigation plans. These are not transmission only plans, but they are significant drivers of transmission spending for things like line hardening, undergrounding, and rebuilding to reduce the wildfire risk of utility infrastructure. Today, they're only really required by regulators in the Western US, I think 14 states. But as wildfire risk increases, we can expect them to become more relevant nationally. Next slide. Across every level of planning, alternative transmission technologies, or ATTs, are or should be on the table. Just a reminder what ATTs are. They're hardware and software solutions that boost a line's capacity. In many cases, they're cheaper, faster, and less land intensive than traditional solutions, including building new lines. ATTs is the umbrella term, if you will, for two categories of tech: grid enhancing technologies and high performance conductors. ATTs will not be the optimal solution in every case. New build will be necessary, but they can be thought of as a key part of a solution set, especially to address near-term needs, because they're faster to deploy, as this chart on the right shows. Despite their clear benefits and the clear opportunities to implement them across the US, they're still underutilized in this country today, but relatively common internationally. That said, we are starting to see momentum build, in large part due to state regulators' engagement and leadership, where states are beginning to require utilities to study ATTs and file those studies with regulators, or develop related implementation plans. And with PERC Order 1920, regional planners must fully consider a handful of ATTs in their long-term plans. Next slide.
All right, so there are several different ways that regulators can engage in regional transmission planning, first and foremost, to ensure cost-effective outcomes for ratepayers. The first is submitting relevant state policies, such as policies related to generation additions or load growth, for inclusion in these regional plans. Ensuring that these policies are incorporated in the plans can make sure that ratepayers are paying for transmission upgrades that are efficient and address those state policy objectives. Failure to incorporate policies in regional plans could result in less accurate planning outcomes or less efficient build-out. So state regulators should definitely be engaging in the stakeholder processes at these regional planning entities, ensuring that their state policies are being incorporated fully into that regional planning modeling. Second, state regulators can request that utilities and planners incorporate and leverage more innovative and least cost solutions such as right sizing, alternative transmission technologies, and non-wires alternatives. These maximize savings for ratepayers, and regulators have a unique ability to make this request given their role in setting many rates for utilities. And we describe those technologies in more detail in the handbook. Third, state regulators can request that local transmission projects receive an independent review by the regional planning entity or a third party. As we've mentioned previously, local transmission projects are often not subjected to adequate oversight, potentially putting ratepayers on the hook for less efficient transmission build-out. A recent example of how state regulators have engaged on this is that ISO New England agreed to host an independent reviewer for local transmission projects after advocacy from New England states. So state regulators can also engage on this local transmission component, and they can also engage on the interregional planning piece. As we noted, interregional planning is rarely done in the US today, but more interregional planning and build out can reduce costs for ratepayers and enhance grid reliability and resilience. State regulators are uniquely poised to make these requests, given their regular engagement in the regional planning process. And finally, on the request piece, state regulators can request that merchant or independent transmission projects be included in these regional and interregional plans and valued for their benefits to ratepayers. Finally, state regulators can identify priority corridors for the siting of transmission, as well as priority zones for generation and load siting. The image on the right of this slide illustrates a zonal planning approach that Illinois has taken through its Renewable Energy Access Plan. By identifying priority siting zones on a state level, state regulators can minimize harm to sensitive areas and ease the overall siting and permitting process, leading to more efficient and cost-effective outcomes for ratepayers. Next slide, please. In addition to engaging on the regional planning, state regulators can also facilitate greater inclusion of transmission into IRPs for states that do IRPs. This could include requiring utilities to model transmission as an alternative to generation or storage, including existing or planned transmission projects in the IRP, improving load forecasting, and requiring open and transparent stakeholder processes for preparing IRPs. All of these actions can collectively advance the most cost-effective outcomes for ratepayers as part of the IRP process. And finally, state regulators can consider whether state-level transmission planning is a good fit for their state and work with other stakeholders in their state to advance such planning. The map on the right illustrates recent planning outcomes from the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority, which has helped Colorado achieve lower cost electricity through proactive transmission planning to meet its state's needs. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Claire. Moving to phase two, once aligned as planned, project costs are then divided up across transmission zones using FERC-approved method. And I want to emphasize this here. At this point, costs are allocated to zones, not customer rate classes. Rate class level allocations will happen later, which we'll cover under state jurisdiction. Another key point is that for regional projects, costs must be roughly in line with the benefits that each zone receives. That's not the case for local projects where costs fall only on the zone where the project is built. As for the methods themselves, planners use a few different approaches. Some allocate costs based on a zone's share of regional load or demand, sometimes called the postage stamp method. Others use DFACS, which looks at a zone's contribution to power flows across the project. And some allocate costs based on the quantified benefits that each zone is expected to receive. State regulators do still have a voice here. Regulators can weigh in on cost allocation debates, and under FERC Order 1920, they're now empowered to help design the default allocation method for long-term regional planning. Next slide.
So our main recommendation on cost allocation is that regulators request benefits-based cost allocation methodologies as part of regional planning that are consistent with FERC orders. Regulators often have a role in the regional planning entities to engage on the development of these cost allocation methodologies, as Alyssa mentioned. Ensuring that costs are assigned roughly commensurate with benefits, as illustrated by this graphic, ensures that ratepayers pay their fair share. And FERC Order 1920 is contributed by establishing a list of 7 minimum benefits for long-term planning, which will help the development of more accurate cost allocation methodologies. Next slide.
Once the project is planned and the costs have been allocated, the developer then needs to secure permits, which happens primarily at the state level. The key one we focus on here is the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or CPCN. This is typically the central permit for siting and building a transmission project. As the map on the right shows, CPCN requirements vary by state, especially by voltage level. A lower voltage threshold to trigger a CPCN requirement means that more projects will be subject to regulatory review. And higher voltage regional projects are almost always going to require a CPCN where states have that requirement as a result. And as a reminder, interstate lines or for interstate lines, developers have to apply for the CPCN in every state that their project crosses and get that approval. And the CPCN approval decision really comes down to whether regulators find the project necessary and in the public interest. How those terms are defined, though, and the extent to which they're weighted depends on each state's specific statutes and to some extent to the commission's discretion. Compared to other states, and Carrie mentioned this briefly at the top, compared to other stages of the transmission process, permitting is where regulators have the most direct decision-making power. But we do want to still emphasize that by the time the project reaches the CPCN stage, especially if we're talking about a regional or interregional project, years of effort have likely already gone into that project. And that's why early proactive engagement is so important in phase 1 and phase 2 to shape the project before it even lands in PUC dockets. Next slide.
When it comes to permitting, there are several actions that regulators can take to advance equitable and cost-effective outcomes. This includes requiring or recommending the inclusion of community benefit plans or agreements as part of issuing a CPCN, especially if a project is going to have major land use impacts or is otherwise very impactful in nature. These plans or agreements can ensure the sharing of benefits with impacted communities proactively while easing potential siting challenges. Second, regulators can require CPCN applicants to demonstrate consideration of more innovative and cost-effective solutions in their applications, including right-sizing, alternative transmission technologies, and non-wires alternatives. If regulators feel that applicants have not adequately considered these technologies, they could deny the CPCN or require modifications to the application. Third, regulators can examine what exemptions or voltage thresholds their state has with respect to CPCNs and compare these to spending trends. If, for instance, regulators are seeing significant investment in projects that are exempted from receiving a CPCN or are below the voltage threshold, regulators could work with their state legislature to integrate additional oversight mechanisms that ensure that ratepayers are not being made to pay for transmission projects that are not receiving adequate oversight. And finally, state regulators can consider the impact of delayed or avoided projects in issuing a CPCN by requiring the applicant to submit relevant analysis and taking that into consideration. We note that regulators' abilities to implement these recommendations in particular may depend on your state's legislative authorities surrounding CPCNs and may require legislative amendments to implement. Next slide, please.
All right. After the project has been permitted and development costs have been incurred, the transmission owner will then file its charges with FERC. And the transmission owner has two options, stated rates, where the utility submits a list of expenses for FERC to review and approve, or formula rates, where FERC approves the formula up front and the utility files annual inputs to calculate that rate. And I want to emphasize here that even though the process runs through FERC, states can still engage. For example, regulators can request information or even challenge formula rate inputs. And then once FERC actually signs off on those charges, the transmission owner will file the approved transmission charges for its zone with state regulators. And state regulators then pass through those charges to customers via rate riders. This is the step, or this is the part in the cycle where costs allocated to a zone finally get divided up across rate classes. And that's when these costs land on ratepayer bills, bringing the transmission life cycle full circle from planning all the way to the customer. Next slide.
All right, so on this last phase, in terms of recommendations for regulators, one action that regulators can take is to allow for rate riders that expedite cost recovery for projects that were regionally approved. This incentivizes regionally planned projects and is illustrated in this flow chart to the right. Kansas has implemented this sort of rate rider incentive approach, for instance, with more details in our handbook, and this can deliver more cost-effective outcomes for ratepayers. Second, regulators can ensure that ratepayers are paying what's fair for large loads by assessing large load tariffs using best practices. For more information on that, see a recent resource from RMI on large load tariffs linked in the Zoom chat. And third, for states that approve transmission rates, these are states with bundled retail rates, state regulators there can consider performance-based rate-making approaches detailed more in our handbook. All right, so with that, I am going to shift us into our Q&A. A reminder to please submit your questions for us via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I am going to start with a couple of questions of my own, though, for Carrie, and then we will incorporate some audience questions. So Carrie, during your time in Illinois, were there any particular moments when the Commission's involvement was central to advancing cost-effective transmission projects? And could you share an example of how your engagement shaped the outcomes in meaningful ways?
Yes, a couple come to mind. So in addition to kind of the obvious, the CPCN process, and you had a nice picture of REAP, which was the our zonal approach to identify places that could make sense to cite these types of lines. I am going to note my service at OMS and at OPSI. Um, so I was serving on the organization of MISO states when we were doing cost allocation for the long range transmission planning process. Um, so if you think about the MISO footprint, it's the largest by land mass and has states that differ greatly in topography and policies and politics and generation. But we all came together as state commissioners and agreed with the first step that we definitely need transmission. And so um, the harder step is obviously how are we all going to divvy up the costs? And we kind of locked ourselves in a room as state commissioners and hashed it out. It wasn't easy. I had some, tough conversations both with my staff internally about the approach forward and also some of my fellow state commissioners. Um, but we got there and now we're kind of seeing the fruit of the labor through the different rollouts of the tranches. I look back on that time and think about, how difficult it was, but it really was worth all the effort. So any chance to engage either as the member of the organization of MISO states or not, because oftentimes you like as a commission in Illinois, we would vote on things on orders at OMS. It's absolutely worth the effort. And then I'll also point to my time on OPSI, which was the RSC for PJM. completely different governance structure and completely different makeup. It's the largest RTO by generation and load, so a lot of different dynamics. I didn't serve an OPSI that long, but I served as the co-chair of ISAC. Your recommendation was to make sure that you add state policies to the planning process. That was more difficult. And I left, and there was great leadership under Commissioner Richard, and I know Commissioner McCabe did a lot of work here. That's why I think FERC Order 1920 is super helpful, particularly in a region like that. But I guess just to sum it up, I think certainly you pointed out all the places that commissioners touch the issues through the CPCN process. But if you are in an ISO RTO, the engagement cannot be understated for transmission.
Absolutely. And if any attendees are wondering what OMS and OPSI are, OMS, Organization of MISO States, OPSI, Organization of PJM States, Inc. So many acronyms in this space. The next question I had for you is, one of the key roles that commissions play with transmission on a state level is the permitting and relatedly local community engagement. So I'm curious how you navigated this complex and sometimes controversial process while at the ICC.
That is, it's difficult. I mean, that's sometimes the some of the hardest cases because of the community engagement piece of it. Obviously, very, very important. You laid out a lot of good examples in your slides. I always say there is one way to build a transmission line, but 1,000 ways to kill it in different places. And oftentimes you'll see issues with not with the community engagement process, but the community that's still frustrated with the outcome and will fight it in different ways. So that is why the CPCN process is so important, right? Like you have to get it right. You have to do the engagement. You have to look at all the alternatives and make sure that you're consistent and explaining the rationale. I think you build trust through consistency when these are huge projects, and when an entity is coming forward to try to build a transmission line, they will absolutely look at what's been done before when they think about the type of community engagement that's required and the things they have to show through the process. So how you engage in the process absolutely matters. I think too, when I sat in Illinois, I always kind of reminded that in Illinois we sat at the crossroads of the middle of the United States. And so thinking of the need for these transmission lines, both the ones that are within state and the ones that flow through multiple states, electrons flow both ways. And it's so important to have the ability both to push the power out so that there's generation that can sell their products, but it's also really important to access it, particularly when it's needed. I was at the commission during Winter Storm Elliott and kind of lived the issues down south in MISO and then up north in PJM. So I really try to think about like explaining what that's like and how much you need transmission. And you kind of don't know you need it until you're in a really bad spot. So I think the messaging is important. I think the community engagement, you have to go obviously deep and you have to make sure that it's well documented throughout the process.
Yeah, no, all really important. And, there's not one clear answer, I feel like, to the tricky questions that we often face with respect to permitting. Um, I'm going to integrate a question from the audience, following up on the, importance of states engaging in regional planning. This audience member asked, how do states designate the officials or entities that participate in regional planning? Is this typically commissioners, energy office officials? Does it vary by state? How can states determine who the people are that are providing information?
Very good question, and it probably differs by commission. I can speak to the Illinois experience. So in Illinois, we the chair assigns who sits on the board of managers at the OPSI and OMS. So obviously it's usually a conversation with commissioners and trying to get understand interest in serving and trying to have some fairness and ability to have these opportunities. But it really is an appointment. It's an appointment by usually the chair of the commission. There may be a voting process at other commissions. But when I'm speaking of the RSC, these boards of OMS and OPSI, that in particular is the state commissioner within the state. There's obviously other stakeholder groups and it's the world of like governance explaining whether consumer advocates can be in a particular group or if a energy officer can be in a particular group and what their rights are and all this and the ability to speak. So it gets a little complex, but that's how we handled it in Illinois.
Got it. Yeah, definitely varies by state, but it's great to have a concrete example on how that played out in Illinois. Um, Next question that I have for you is related to capacity and staff capacity. State regulators often face capacity or other barriers for doing this engagement on transmission issues. So from your experience, what partnerships, resources, or changes can help regulators overcome these challenges and play a more proactive role throughout the transmission life cycle?
Yeah, I think I'll speak to a couple that I was certainly was aware of when I was at the commission, and then just more that I've been made aware of since my time at the American Clean Power Association, where I focused on this issue. So some of the obvious answers when you're a commissioner is other commissioners. The ability to call up commissioners like through OMS or OPSI or NARUC is super important. The thing about serving at a commission is you have a lot of roles. Obviously, I don't want to call it your day job because one isn't more important than the other, but that the rate making process, the regulating of the various types of utilities, also not just electricity, but water and gas. And then you can have it play a fun game with bingo cards of what other things commissions regulate. Like we regulated safety of railroad crossings. So all kinds of stuff, right? You're doing all the things. And the ability to follow what's happening in the RTO is a really tough task. So you absolutely have to spend the time. I thought it was completely worth it. But also equally important is your staff, right? So um, I think investing in staff is super important. I know when we would engage in these conversations at the different RTOs, certainly the staff was a crucial part and we would lean on them greatly. But what I witnessed is that no one had enough staff. We were part of two RTOs, and while I was there, we had about three people that were working on this stuff, on these federal issues. That certainly wasn't enough. But there were some commissions that had one, and even working on it part-time. So I think investing in staff is super important, even if you have the ability to contract out for support is really important. And then another thing that I have learned a lot about since I've stepped over to this side of things are the technical resources. So I now have a view into the costs of some of these studies. They are very, very, very expensive, but they are often well done, like using like a really reputable, like a Brattle is really wonderful, and they put together and do deep dives and have a lot of integrity in their work. And it can seem sometimes a little biased by who is supporting it and funding it, but nevertheless, there are these power marketing authorities and companies that can look deep into what a certain type of, where if transmission was built in a certain way in a certain place, what that would do for cost and reliability. So I think leaning on that, obviously the DOE has resources, the national labs have resources. I think the problem is when you're a commissioner is knowing they exist. I think that's the biggest problem, and then knowing where to find them. So I think the onus is on RMI and ACP, for example, to push it out. But still, I think the technical resources can be super important when talking to elected officials or talking to other commissioners or talking to even your utilities, using the information to really get the right answer.
Yeah, those are all some great examples of additional resources that commissions and commission staff can lean on. Um, I want to bring in a question from the audience because I know that we've been talking a lot about RTOs and states and RTOs. So I'll offer some thoughts on this, and then Carrie, I know that you were a commissioner in an RTO state, but if you have thoughts on non-RTO regions, feel free to share them. But the question that we got was, what would we recommend for states that aren't part of RTOs and have vertically integrated utilities? And the thoughts that I would offer with respect to that is we wrote this handbook to be accessible to states across the US, and that definitely includes non-RTO states. There's a lot that state commissions in those states can do to advance cost-effective transmission build-out. A couple examples, they can advocate for more regional transmission planning. So even if you aren't in an RTO, you do still have a regional planning entity responsible for your region of the country. Um, there is actually a map of those regions in the handbook that you can look up to figure out what regional planning entity you're a part of, even if you aren't in an RTO. So advocating for more regional transmission planning can help reduce costs in your region, wherever you're located in the US. And then if your state does IRPs, you can definitely be engaging on the IRPs and ensuring that transmission is being modeled as part of the IRPs, as part of a cost-effective alternative to new generation assets. And then your state almost certainly has a role to play in the permitting of those lines and the issuance of CPCNs. So all the permitting recommendations in our handbook would still absolutely apply there. So those are just a couple examples of what can be done in non-RTO states. Carrie, anything you would want to add?
I think I have to start by saying that your question is about non-RTO states, but we advocate for market expansion. So I have to start by saying that markets are great. We have proven data about regions that enter markets and how it drives down costs and increased reliability. And we're seeing this in the Western expansion, right? Like it's actually happening. There is Western expansion of RTOs. And to Claire's point, obviously there's these balancing authorities, but I think, continuing to recognize the benefits of markets, it's interesting because every so often, an article will pop up and say how we shouldn't have markets. And so sometimes I think personally, I think there's some misinformation around it that kind of flies. So I have to add that. And I'm in Illinois was a non-IRP state, so I don't have as much of a inside perspective on that, but just, all of Claire's points make really good sense.
Great. The next question I wanted to ask you was, a lot of commission's work is defined by legislation. What was your relationship like with the state legislature while you were on the Illinois Commission?
Yeah. I think your relationship with your state legislature is super important. It's tricky because they often don't care about you or know about you unless something goes wrong. Like we were hailed down to the state house when prices went up through a capacity auction in MISO suddenly and then hit the bills 2 months later, which is interesting because I know we talked a lot about ability to make impact. That was done through an RTO, and the Illinois Commerce Commission can only do so much to directly change course. We did do some things, but it takes time. So my point is you will get in front of legislators when they're angry, and it's oftentimes difficult to answer their questions directly unless they have a base knowledge. So legislators are very intelligent people, but they have to know a lot about a lot. And this pertains, I do some work in the Capitol as well. They have to know a lot about a lot, and they bring in their life experience, and they all have very different life experience. So I think the education piece, particularly before you're in hot water, is super important. And always like it's always tricky to decide where to start, right? You don't want to be condescending or talk down to anyone, but you also have to figure out what's the right baseline. So I think educating on transmission is super important. It's hard because you're trying to convince both state legislators and Congress that in order to bring down prices, you have to pay more, right? Because like transmission costs money and the outcome is lower cost. But that is really hard to make the argument. It's especially hard to make it simply without going into at least 10 sentences is why I can say that. So, and then by the time you get to the 10th sentence, they often lose interest. So it's not easy, but I thought it was always really important. I would have regular conversations with my governor's office. I would have regular conversations with the chair of the Energy Committee in our Senate. So if you find a legislator that you are talking to and they express interest and ask more questions, I think it's good to kind of dig down into that space. But I will also say that you want to make sure that you are maintaining independence from politics, right? Energy, unfortunately, and transmission has become political. It should not be, but it is the reality. So you really have to strike a balance between being available for questions and for testimony, but do not let the day-to-day politics drive regulatory outcomes.
That's some great advice, salient for today. Wanted to bring in an audience question on the point of transmission costs. Someone asked about alternatives to financing transmission, like using revenue bonds. I know that state agencies like the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority has been exploring issuing these. Revenue bonds can generally cost less for the money than utility equity or commercial debt, notes our question asker. So I'm curious, Carrie, if you ever dealt with revenue bonds during your work in Illinois. I will say that on the RMI side, this is absolutely a tool that we are exploring deploying in different regions across the US.
I don't have a lot of intelligence to add to this, but I do think it raises a good point about how these lines are paid for in different models. Um, I think about, and this isn't, again, it isn't exactly answering the question, but thinking of things like I know there was a lot of opportunity through the loan office, through the DOE. That was an interesting way to support these lines, particularly interregional. That was super important. And I also think about merchant transmission lines, which can be really important ways to build out transmission. And I can't claim to be an expert, but I'm trying to learn a lot more about business models of merchant lines. And the answer is they all have very different business models, like how they proceed and how they're able to build things and how they're able to secure the funding for it. I know Grid United is a good example of an organization that can build their own or they can work through a utility, and so they're nimble and there's interesting ways to finance these. So that I just think that that's important to think of all those other opportunities.
Yeah, for sure. Keeping many different options on the table. Um, I'm going to bring in another audience question. This person asks, how do you increase knowledge and access to the public on transmission decisions? They noted that we'd mentioned NARUC, the legislature, and community engagement around CPCNs, but generally speaking, how would you recommend increasing general awareness about this important topic? Any best practices?
I think at ACP in my work I do now, we spend time putting together things like fact sheets, and there's lists of benefits to transmission, and thinking about the audience, whoever you're talking to, and maybe highlighting different benefits. Like for example, um, the problem we're seeing now, and I was alluding to this, is that there is this undercurrent that transmission is only being built because of renewables. That is the only reason, and that's only benefiting renewables. So we usually have to push back, not being defensive, but talking about the benefits of transmission. Um, a great example is national security. So it's when we're talking to certain folks on the Hill or people in the general public, we talk about how important transmission is for national security. We talk about economic benefits, not only the economic benefits of building the line, obviously creates jobs while you're building it, but once the line is built, it attracts more manufacturing and data centers if you want a data center. I worked a lot when I was at the commission with our economic office and economic development office. And what we kept hearing was when we were trying to woo companies to come to Illinois, they wanted cheap power, reliable power. And if you had already had infrastructure in place and so when they connected, they didn't have to pay as much for upgrades. That was a huge benefit. So you also bring those types of jobs in. And then obviously you don't want to be a governor or a policymaker or anybody in the public in a state where you did not invest in transmission and then the power goes out for days. I mean, we have a great, a sad example of what happened in Winter Storm Uri when 250 people died because of the outages and a 10-year-old boy froze to death in his bed. Like these things are real and they happen and we have examples. So I think figuring out what will resonate with whoever you're talking to is important. But the reality is there's all kinds of resources that I've personally created, and I'm sure RMI has all kinds of resources of the multiple benefits of transmission.
Absolutely. That's a great recommendation on messaging, and a good reminder that transmission can help to save lives in some cases. Um, I think I'm going to ask one last question before we wrap up. What is something you wish you had done differently while you were a commissioner?
I think we talked a bit about telling the transmission story publicly. I wish I would have done that better. And we talked about more systematic staff support, making sure you have the right support. But I think if I had to pick kind of one thing, you mentioned it a couple of times, but it is one of the hardest issues to solve for is interregional transmission. So we had this conversation with our members often, like who is going to finally push us over the finish line to get this done? Like, is it Congress that we need? Is it FERC? Is it state commissioners? I personally think you probably need leadership in all the places, but I wish I would have pushed harder on interregional. I don't know what that would have looked like. I know this was a topic of conversation at the Midwest Governors Association when Governor Pritzker was leading it. But I think that explaining why not just transmission, but interregional transmission is really the key to our to the everything to like connecting these data centers and safety and extreme weather. It really can solve a lot of these problems. So I think I wish I would have spent more time making that one of my main talking points while I was a commissioner.
All right. Well, that's a great message to end our Q&A on is beating the drum for interregional transmission. With that, I am going to draw us to a close. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the importance of state regulators for cost-effective transmission build-out. And a special thank you to Carrie for joining us today. We have been recording this session, and the recording will be posted on the event page, the same one that you used to register for the webinar, within 24 hours, along with links where you can download the slide deck that we shared and the full handbook. We also welcome inbounds from state regulators interested in additional research, analytical, or advisory support. There is a form on the handbook webpage that you can fill out to indicate interest, or you can email Alyssa and me. Our emails are on the screen. The QR code on the screen will take you straight to the event page so that you can bookmark it and return to it as resources are added over the next day or so. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.